The ideas and information discussed in this webinar are featured in Todd Stanley's book, Promoting Rigor Through Higher Level Questioning, Practical Strategies for Developing Students' Critical Thinking, available from proofrock.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your favorite local bookseller.
So let me tell you a little bit about Todd Stanley. Todd, in addition to the 14 books he has written, is 18 years in the classroom. He's a national board certified teacher. He helped build a gifted academy for grades 5 through 8 in his local district, and he is the gifted services coordinator for Pickerington local school district in Ohio, a guy with a lot of practical experience and a lot of knowledge. Well, welcome, Todd. We sure do appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so Todd, what we're going to focus on today is this sort of higher order thinking and how we can build rigorous thinking with kids. Can you tell us in your mind, like as you're thinking about higher order thinking, what is higher order thinking, and what is the kind of questioning that promotes that kind of higher order thinking?
So higher order thinking is just the type of thinking that a student is doing. So in other words, and there's lots of different structures that you can use. I prefer to use Bloom's taxonomy. There's other ones that can be used as well, and they're talked about in the book. But when you look at Bloom's taxonomy, you have your lower level questions, which are recall or understanding questions. And so basically, you're just repeating back what you were told. So you were given a piece of information, and you're able to take that information and comprehend that, and then tell someone else about that same information. The higher order thinking I'm talking about is then to take that information into kind of mold it into something else. So to either create something, or to dig a little bit deeper and analyze something and ask questions of it, or to judge whether something, or evaluate whether something is legitimate or not. And so it's just a different type of thinking. And so when I'm working with gifted students, people always say, like, what is the best way to differentiate with gifted kids? Like, there's some secret sauce you can just get from the store and just sprinkle on them. But the reality is that differentiation is really hard. But an easy way to differentiate is the questions that you ask. So I might ask one student a question in one way, and then another student I'll ask in another way, because I know they can handle the higher level one. So it's knowing your students and where they're at, and then asking the appropriate questions, and knowing that not one question fits all sizes. In other words, it's not just one broad question that everyone has to answer. You may have to mix that up a little bit. So, and that's what I kind of talk about there in the book as well. So.
Yeah, and I was thinking that the way you characterize it, I don't think you say this outright, but I gathered this as I was reading. One of the components of higher order thinking is allowing a kid to deal with nuance. That it is so easy with, to sort of have polarized thinking about things, and there's an easy answer to one way or the other. But the truth is often sort of messy, and it's in the middle, and letting a kid question their assumptions and challenging their own kind of thinking is important. And I thought about, obviously the the political polarization that we have today and everything else. It just feels like we're so often falling into tribes and having someone tell us what to think. And I thought that the power of the higher order thinking is that we're able to deal with nuance and grapple with our own assumptions. Can you talk a little bit about not just the political sense, but I mean in terms of jobs and life? Why are these kind of critical thinking skills important for kids today?
Because when you look at what employers are looking for from people who are going out into the workforce, they're looking that the top things they're looking for are creative thinkers. They're looking for people who are adaptive, can adapt quite easily. They're not looking for people who will come in and be robots. They're looking for people that are going to be thinking. And that's what these types of questions are meant to stimulate. They're meant to stimulate the thinking of a student. So when you're asking higher order questions, what you're doing is, and here's the thing that makes it real easy, is that these kids come with this, programmed in them already from birth. That kid that asks a billion questions, they're just really inquisitive. They're asking questions because they want to know. And sometimes finding the answer is kind of disappointing. When you finally figure out how something works, like, that's it. Oh, it was much more interesting the way I was coming up with. So it's good to challenge kids and to have them thinking about, a different way of looking at something. And because what we want to do is, we don't want to create, people that can regurgitate information. We want to create people that can think for themselves, because that's the only way that we advance. Because if we just learn what is out there and that's all we know, we're not making anything new. There's no technology advancement. There's no advancement in thinking. There's no interesting thought-provoking books being written. And so I want to create thinkers in my classroom. And I think that higher order questioning is a good way to do that.
You know, and since we're kind of in this period where we're, you know, defining what we're talking about and why we want to do it, let me also bring in that other word, the, you know, promoting rigor through higher order thinking skills. I tell you what, let me pull a quote from your book. You quote the glossary of education reform. In education, rigor is commonly applied to lessons that encourage students to question their assumptions and think deeply, rather than to lessons that merely demand memorization and information recall. I thought that was a fantastic sort of putting a line in the sand and saying, when we talk about rigor, we're not just talking about giving a bunch more work and making it more difficult or something. Rigor, in your way of thinking, is a habit of mind. It's a kind of how we attack a problem. Talk a little bit about, you know, your conceptualization of rigor in the classroom.
Sure. I'm going to grab the screen real quick, actually, to show you. So let me. Oh, I'm not allowed to.
Oh, you know what?
Share.
You know what? Zoom has incorporated a whole bunch of new security measures, and so I think you can do it now.
Okay.
Give it a try.
Yes. All right. We're good.
Okay.
All right. So, so the one thing I think that's really challenging is to try to explain to someone the difference between rigor and hard. So when I tell people to ask rigorous questions, a lot of time what they're thinking of is, I've got to ask a harder question. So I've got to ask a question with 7 digits in it rather than 6 digits in it. Well, no, the student, if they're doing addition or multiplication or whatever the math skill, is still doing the same skill. Whether you add numbers or complexity or whatever, it's still the same skill. Rigor is accessing that higher level thinking, is like what I'm talking about. So, for example, I give an example here. So if you asked anyone who the 17th Vice President of the United States is, most people could not give you that answer. Because it's not something that we bother to learn or to memorize. But if you did learn it, you'd have to read it in a book or see it in a program, and you could regurgitate that back. And where does that get you? It doesn't get you anywhere unless you've gone to Jeopardy. Then it's really helpful. But if you were to ask a question instead of a student, who do you think's been a really successful vice president? There are 47 different answers that kids could give. And they can have lots of justifications for their answers. And so you can see that the close and open-endedness of that kind of question. So if I ask who's the 17th Vice President of the United States, by the way, I don't know who it is. I ask that question all the time, and I never bother to look it up. Although usually people will say, oh, I looked it up on my phone, and that's how they're finding. But my opinion is, if you can look it up on your phone, it's not higher order thinking. You know, it is a lower level question. But you know, if I ask that question, then they answer it, and it's a dead end. It's not going any further. It has stopped. That, you know, any thought has stopped because they've answered it correctly. Or if they answered incorrectly, I correct them, and it's done. But if I ask them, you know, who do you think's been a successful vice president? The possibilities are endless, and they can think for hours on that, and they could, you know, have discussions on that, and write papers on that, and there are scholars that write stuff on that all the time. So you can see how being rigorous as opposed to hard just opens up so much more in your classroom. And so I'll give you some examples of what I mean by this. So if you ask a question like, what is the circumference of the earth? And that's kind of a tough question, but is it hard or rigorous? And there's 5 of these. So the other one is, when should you use the Pythagorean theorem? I always put that wrong, theorem. And so is that a hard or a rigorous question? What is the best kind of government? Is that a hard or rigorous? Why is the sky blue? Is that hard or rigorous? And what is the theme of the book Frankenstein? And so some people, when I give seminars or give workshops and I run this by, people are actually answering the opposite. So the circumference of the earth is definitely just a hard question. It's something that you would read somewhere. You could make it a little more rigorous by saying, well, that's the circumference at the equator. What's the circumference at the prime meridian? What's the circumference of the, you know, but it's still all facts that you have to look up somewhere. Pythagorean theorem is also a hard question. It is not it's not a rigorous question, because the application of that is going to look the same no matter where you're applying it. However, if I ask you the best type of government, you can make lots of arguments. So kids could say, I think communism is good for this reason. I think socialism. I think monarchy. They can make all sorts of really interesting arguments. Similarly with the sky is blue, and this one's a kind of a trick question because it's both. Because if I ask a science class in high school why the sky is blue, they can tell me scientifically why the sky is blue. But if you ask a second grader why they think the sky is blue, and they're going, oh, well, because God had the color blue in his crayon box, or, because the grass is green and the sun is yellow, it makes blue in the middle. And that's why they're going to come up with all sorts of really rigorous, creative questions. But you can see how open-ended that is, lots of possibilities. Even looking at the theme of Frankenstein, some people err on the side that that's rigorous because it's an interpretation. But the reality is it's not. It is reading between the lines when you read the book Frankenstein. But in other words, doesn't say anywhere, this is the theme of my book. Mary Shelley never says that. But if you read between the lines, it's obvious what the themes are. And you can if you put themes of Frankenstein in the word search, you're going to get what those major themes are. So that's just a hard question. And so the struggle that I have is when I ask teachers to ask kids more rigorous questions, they just go to the hard questions. And that's not what we want. We want to access that higher level thinking of evaluate, of analysis, and of creating is what we want to do with the higher level thinking.
That came up when I had the privilege of talking to the folks at the College of William and Mary about the Jacob's Ladder reading series. Part of the Jacob's Ladder reading series, you take this advanced reading material, and then you're asking higher order questions about that material. But one of the mistakes that can happen in classrooms is the teacher will just ask, well, just fill in the blank, under that question or whatever. And the part of building a culture for higher order thinking in the classroom is that first answer isn't where you stop. You're building on that first answer. You're asking for a kid to tease out the next layer of the onion, as it were. How does that dialogue happen in a classroom in your way of thinking?
So, well, and what you're talking about, which I talk about, is I think is one of the most important aspects of asking a higher level question are those probing questions. So you can start by asking a lower level question, but do you follow it up with a question after that? So the example I always use with my students when I'm trying to teach them how to write an essay, I'll say to them, what is your favorite color? And every kid can immediately tell me what their favorite color is because they've had that favorite color for years. And then I tell them, well, can you explain why it's your favorite color? And then all of a sudden you can see the gears start turning in kids' heads, and they're like, oh, why is that my favorite color? It's always kind of been my go-to color, but I haven't really analyzed why that is my favorite color. And so I would have students kind of explore that. And I did that in the first week of school. I said, I would say, well, you're going to take a lot of essay assessments in this particular class. And so I want you to get the idea of thinking beyond just the question. And so I asked them, what is your favorite color and why? And then we looked at exemplars, we looked at examples of good responses. But the best responses we would determine are the ones that had detail and examples. And I wouldn't say that to them. They would say, oh, well, that one's really good because it has a lot of examples. And I'd be like, and secretly I'd be saying, yes, that's what I want you to understand is that you need to put examples. I need you to put details. I need you to be thinking. And so it is creating a culture in your classroom. So when kids come into my classroom, even, I'm not asking them, how's your day going? Or, because you get the same answer, it's fine. Or, or you get that kid who will tell you everything that's wrong, which you really don't want to hear. But, so I started asking more thought-provoking questions of kids. Like, hey, when a kid walks in my classroom, I would say, if you could change anything about the school, what would it be and why? And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, that's an interesting question. And so all of a sudden there's a level of engagement there because they're being asked something that's causing them to think. Because the reality is we really like thinking. We really like to play with things and explore things. We're curious. We're a curious species. And so being able to tap into that is important. But again, you have to establish that in your classroom. So for example, in my classroom, kids, I had a no hands policy in my classroom. You could not raise your hand to answer a question. I would just call on anyone randomly, so anyone should expect that they would be called on. And I always had follow-up questions in mind. So, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, scripting. So I may say, here's my starting question, but here are some probing questions I'm going to follow that up with. And when I first started out, I would write those down and put them on index cards. But then when you get the hang of it, then you can just naturally start to ask those. And so when kids came in my classroom, they knew that they could be asked a question at any time and ask a follow-up question at any time, and they had to be ready for that. And so when they came into my class, it was not a big, like you have those classrooms where you call on a kid because, and they're like horribly embarrassed. They just knew that that was the expectation of my classroom. And so they weren't embarrassed. They were like, oh, they made an attempt, or I had outs. I had like phone, it was back when Once a Millionaire was big. It tells you how long I've been teaching. And they were like, they could phone a friend. They could do 50-50. They could do different things. But I definitely spent a lot of purposeful time establishing a culture of higher level questioning in my classroom. And at the same time, it's got to be a two-way street. You've got to allow kids to ask higher level questions themselves. So we all have that kid in our classroom when you're talking about something or you're giving information, the kid raises his hand and asks this really off the wall question. And a lot of times our first reaction is to dismiss that because I only have so much time to teach what I have to teach and I can't be distracted by this. But really what we should be doing is exploring what that student is bringing up and taking it down a path and see where it leads. And sometimes it doesn't lead anywhere. And some people think that's a waste of time, but it's not a waste of time. That exploration is getting them thinking, is going to cause them to remember anything that you try to teach them much more than if you tried to make them memorize it. Because the reality is what most kids do. I found out when I first started teaching, I gave a lot of traditional assessments. And what students did was they memorized the content long enough to take the test, and then 2 weeks later it was gone. And these were gifted kids, and these were really bright kids, and I was like wasting my time. I was wasting their time. I was wasting classroom time. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna stop asking these lower level questions in my classroom, and I'm gonna ask higher level questions, because you have to, in order to answer those, you have to have a good understanding of that. And so you have to really learn it rather than just know it, because there's a big difference between knowing something and learning something. Because I can repeat back, things I read in a book. It doesn't mean I've learned how to do it. So.
Yeah, no, I was in preparation for this, not because it had to do with a question. I was just thinking about the topic and, just literally how much stuff I forgot from from high school and on. And there was some quote, and I can't even remember where I picked it up, but it was something about, learning is what you didn't forget.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that forgetting. Talk about, because when I was teaching, Bloom's taxonomy was the thing we were using then in order to give us some kind of hierarchy and construct. We could think about higher order thinking. So you're still using it in your book. Why is that a valuable framework? Why is it something that you think is useful to teachers?
So I'm going to grab the screen again. So I'll show you. I'm a really, you know me, Joel. I'm a very simple guy. Not real complicated. I like things simple. And the nice thing about Bloom's taxonomy, even though it was written, I think, in 1952, is our thinking has not changed. We still think at the same level. So it's not like it becomes outdated. And what it does is it categorizes these levels of thinking. So what I can do, and this is the important part, what I can do as a teacher is I can do, because if you ask a teacher, are you asking higher level questions on your assessments, they'll say, of course I am. But if you actually, and this was what happened to me, and I actually sat down with my assessment and scrutinized them, and I used a graphic organizer that looked like this, where I took all my questions and I categorized them as at the different levels of Bloom's. And I would have bet my paycheck that I was asking a lot of higher level questions. And yet when I broke it down and really looked at it, I was asking mostly lower level questions. And so I had to go back and kind of rewrite some of my assessments and rethink my assessments, because I wasn't asking those questions. But it was Bloom's taxonomy that allowed me to do that. And the reason why is the nice thing about Bloom's is it has these verbs that typically clue you into what level of thinking is going on. It doesn't always mean that. Like you could write a question that said, build what 2 + 2 is. That's not creating, that's just a simple application. But most of the times, the verb that you're using in your question is an indication of the level of thinking that students are going to have to do. So I know that if I have a lot of questions that have, compare, contrast, assess, develop, things like that, then they're doing higher level thinking. If I'm asking questions that ask them to define something, or to, to add something, or to, choose something, then they're doing lower level. And so I think half the battle of this higher, lower level questions in the classroom is your awareness. And Bloom's taxonomy is just a great construct to kind of become aware of what you're doing. Because what I would do, even when I was asking questions of my students in discussions, I was marking how many higher and lower level questions I was asking. Because I was like, oh, well, in discussions, of course I ask higher level questions. But I was disappointed again that I was not. And so I became very aware of that. And so, and being cognizant of that, I could then add higher level questions in there, change things here and there. So it became really important to have something, because if you just evaluate yourself without using a construct, if you just say, yes, I'm asking higher level questions, well, what are you basing that on? What is the construct that is doing that? And that's what Bloom's allows you to do. And I love Bloom's because it gives you a natural scaffold. So one thing that I make sure I try to make very clear in the book is you should not be asking all higher level questions and ignoring the lower level questions. The lower level questions are important for building the foundation, because you can't do the higher level questions without the lower level knowledge. So I can't ask kids to compare and contrast the North and the South in the Civil War unless they understand what the North and the South, what their thought process was and what their philosophy was during the war and whatever. So I have to start at this bottom part and then scaffold my way up. So by the end, when I was in the classroom, when I was finishing up in the classroom, how my assessments looked is I would ask 3 questions. And the first question I would ask would always be a remembering or understanding question. And it kind of built confidence. It allowed kids to access what they knew. And then my second question was always an analyzing, applying question, where they had to dig a little bit deeper. And then my last question was always a creating or evaluating question. And so, and these 3 question exams, and this was for 7th, 5th, and 6th, and 7th graders, would take kids like an hour and a half to take, because not because of I expected all this content, but just because once you get the wheel spinning on these kids, they just want to tell you everything that all their thoughts and all their, imagination. So, and that's amazing to read that. And that's where I think it becomes difficult to ask higher level questions for some teachers, because the reality is it's really hard. Because if I'm grading my 3 question essay and I have 150 kids, which is what I had, so I'm grading 450 essays, that's a lot of work. And it would take me whole weekends to get that done. If I'm asking 10 multiple choice questions that are all mostly lower level, probably closed-ended questions, I can run it through a Scantron or some device and have it graded in no time. And so it does also require, in addition to the awareness that a teacher has to have, it does take a level of commitment that you are going to, you're going to be giving yourself some more work. But I always thought it was totally worth it, because my students remembered things 5, 6, 7 years later, rather than 5, 6, 7 days later, they were forgetting it. And so I wanted them to have that enduring understanding, and that higher level questioning requires them to have an enduring understanding of what it is they're talking about. Because like you said, you thought about things that you've forgotten in school. I've been helping my 12-year-old a lot with our stay-at-home order in Ohio, with her junior high work. And I'm like, why are you learning this stuff? Who cares? Why do you have, there was this one science one where they had to identify different types of winds. And there's like a westerly wind. And there were winds I'd never heard of. I'm 47 years old. I've never, ever used this information ever. The only reason why you would ever need to know it is if you're a meteorologist. And so, I question, like, why are they asking these types of questions? My older daughter, who was taking an AP American history class, I kid you not, one of the questions on her exam was, how deep was the Erie Canal? And I'm like, who cares? You're never going to get a job interview and people are going to say, okay, you can have the job on one condition. You need to be able to tell me how deep the Erie Canal. No one's going to be asked that question. They are going to be asked how well you think on your feet. They are going to be asked how creative you can be, or how well you can bring ideas to the table. Because the reality is, that's what businesses and the workplace wants. They want people that are going to bring ideas, because that's how you innovate and that's how you make money, is because these innovations and this new type of thinking, other people are going to want it. And so when Steve Jobs comes up with the iPod, and the iPhone, those are brand new ideas, kind of outside the box thinking, couldn't have been done before. On Star Trek, it was like 200 years in the future, using, a walkie like that. And now we have computers that are in our pockets. And so, but that takes that innovative thinking, that higher order thinking, in order to be able to do that. And it's not to say that the world doesn't need people who can remember things. Like, I probably want my plumber to be able to know what to do, in any given time. But there are times where he has to be creative. I had a plumber out during this whole time, and he was trying to solve a problem, and he had to problem solve, and he was using that skill in order to do that. And so, if I can equip a kid with that skill, leaving my classroom, I know they'll be successful no matter what they do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I got one more question, and then we're going to let Stephanie take over. But uh, after I do a little bit of housekeeping, but the last question really, let's say I always think of, I used to have this idea of Proof Rock Press is as we are servicing what, if you were in a business school, would be called the guerrilla teachers. They're like this group out there doing all of this super interesting stuff. They don't always fit the available boxes and pigeonholes. They're looking to do this kind of stuff. They are currently attending this webinar because they want to do, you know, higher order thinking skills, and they're willing to put forth the effort. So just kind of as a little pep talk maybe, or whatnot, can you talk to that teacher who's coming in, that guerrilla teacher's like, I want to really implement this. What is something that you can do to get started with this kind of work?
Sure. Real quick though, I'm going to backtrack for just a second, because something you said really interesting is that guerrilla teacher. The reality is when I started to analyze, I'm going to grab the screen again. The reality is when I started looking at our state assessment that we give in Ohio, we give the, we used to give, the test that a lot of states give, but now we give the air test. What I started to find was that the state, which we criticize a lot for all the things that they do, actually ask a lot of higher level questions on their exams. And so what we did one time is we sat down as a math department in the 5th grade, and we looked at the air exam, and we looked at the way they were teaching standards. And what they found is they were not teaching the standard to the level that it was being asked of. And how you determine that is the noun is the what of what the content standard is. The verb is the level of thinking that's going to be at. So here's a Common Core ELA question. Write informative text to examine, and you guys can read all that. But if you pull out the verbs, you have write, examine, and analysis. Those are all 3 higher level forms of thinking. And so if you're not having kids think, asking higher level questions, or having them do higher level activities, you are not preparing them for that standard. And so this was really eye-opening for our math department, because they were like, oh my goodness, we have been failing kids for years. So it may seem guerrilla, but the reality is that the school system expects us to produce thinkers as well. And so we've got to be, it's our job as teachers to be creating these thinkers rather than, just memorizers. Because the reality is school can be a game. And so kids learn how to play that game. And so you have to kind of change the rules of the game from time to time. So if you're going to get started in this, the way I started, I can only tell you the way I started, and I thought it was very effective, is I went to my written stuff first. So any worksheets or homework or assessments I gave, I went and took Bloom's verbs, and I made. And by the way, if you, I do have like a questioning toolkit, which you can access here at this website, thegiftedguide.com, under resources. I do have like a thing of Bloom's taxonomy, the verbs. I have question stems, things like that. But what I would do is I had this little flip chart. It was a Bloom's flip chart, and it gave you these types of questions that look kind of like this, which are what we call stems or openers. And so what I started doing is rewriting my assessments using these openers as my as a way to get to higher level thinking. So that was a really easy way to get started. And then what I would do is, if I was going to have a discussion with students, I would always write out 10 questions that I wanted to ask. And I made sure I used these openers to kind of trigger that. And I knew I wasn't going to get to all 10 questions. And I knew that there were going to be different paths that we were going to travel on, but I had it there as a guide. And if I got to all my questions, I got to all my questions. If I didn't, then that was good. That meant the conversation was really good. Because another thing I see in the classroom that is always disappointing is you ask a question and a kid gives a really intriguing answer, and then you just move on to the next question instead of exploring that. I mean, that breaks my heart when I see that, because that kid has brought up something that everyone can learn from, and yet we just move on to the next question. So we have to, as teachers, we have to think a little bit differently. Like you said, the mindset. One thing that I think is a really easy thing to do in the classroom, and it's under this techniques for successful questioning. This PowerPoint is also on that website as well, by the way, is this idea of wait time. And wait time is really simple. When you ask a question, don't take the first hand that raises. Tell them, I want you guys to think about this for a minute or so, or have them write for a minute or so, or, you know, have them type in a Google Doc or whatever for a minute or so before they answer a question. Because as I often joke, the first thing that comes into your head is not always the best thing. And I can prove that with the arguments I've had with my wife over the years. Because the first thing I usually say is the wrong thing. But if I take my time and I really think about it, I can come up with a very thoughtful response, and one that's going to be more productive. And same thing in the classroom. If you tell kids, look, I don't want the first hand that goes up. I want us to think about this, and you give them that wait time, then that you're going to be rewarded with much better answers. And so, but that requires, for a teacher, especially teachers starting out, is it requires slowing things down a little bit, and not, because I know the one thing that teachers always say they never have enough of is time, and I get that. But you're actually wasting their time if you're going through something so quickly that they're not remembering it later. So you have to, you know, weigh that enduring understanding versus getting everything covered. Because I was able to get everything covered in my classroom, but I was able to do it, what I felt, as an enduring understanding where kids would know, you know, years later, you know, what it is that they had learned.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Let me hijack a little bit here, and I'm going to just take a moment to do some housekeeping for the folks attending. Let me give you first, this is Todd Stanley's contact information. I've got his, take a screenshot of that. I won't leave it up there for you to like write all of that down, but if you just take a quick screenshot, you'll have Todd's website, his email.
And you can crop out my photo because it's horrendous. So
I like that one. I picked that one because I thought that was very stoic. And also his Twitter feed. And Todd is one of those good people that is more than happy to answer questions and that sort of thing if you'd like to circle back and contact him. The other thing I want to for those of you who need to take one more screenshot, let me mention his book here. If you'll take a screenshot of that, you can get the ISBN. I mentioned that it's on proofrock.com, on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, and the local bookstores when they open back up. I also want to mention, while I've got this up, that I will be sending the certificates of attendance to those of you who have attended. But give me 3 days, and then also I'll be sending a link to the recording of this webinar in about 3 days as well to everyone who registered. So let me now turn this over to Stephanie. Oh, and by the way, we used to have this deal with Zoom where you could upvote questions, but I think they've leveled in some new useful security features where you can't upvote some of the questions. So Stephanie's kind of like scrambling a little bit here because she doesn't know what people think is the most important question. So she'll be dancing a little bit here as we go. But thank you for your questions, and if you have more, just throw them up there, and Stephanie's going to be sort of moderating the questions to Todd here.
All right, sure thing. So one that I found interesting, how do you handle time management with higher order questions? If students need a long time to kind of talk out the higher order questions and your class only lasts 40 to 50 minutes, how do you manage that?
You just have to carve out the time and be willing to give that time. I think as teachers, sometimes we're sharks. We feel like we always have to be moving forward to be successful. But the reality is when you stop a little bit, and if I may use a cliche, and smell the roses, if you just have students reflect. Towards the end of the one thing I really learned, the best skill I learned towards the end of my time in the classroom was reflection. And so I hadn't done it before very much. And so at the end of any unit or end of any project, we always reflected. And taking that time to do that reflection was so rewarding. I learned so much about my students. My students learned so much about what my intentions were or what they learned from it. And those are valuable lessons for kids to learn. And I know some people may say, well, he's a social studies teacher. No one cares about social studies, so it's okay if they don't get everything covered. But the reality is I also taught math and ELA throughout my years in teaching as well. And I know you have to get everything in, but again, taking that time and spending a little more time on something is going to be rewarding in the end, because then students are going to be able to use that information and mold it into whatever they're able to do that. Because the reality is the top 10 jobs, by the time your kids graduate, unless they're seniors right now, the top 10 jobs that are out there don't exist right now. That will be 5 years from now. So how do you prepare a kid for a job that doesn't exist? Because it used to be kids would have a vocation, you would train them in that, and then they would go do that for 30 years and get a gold watch at the end of it. Well, that's not the way things are anymore. And so the way you train kids to be ready for jobs that don't exist is to prepare them for anything by having them able to think at higher levels and to be able to be creative and to be innovative.
Great. Yeah, and I know you mentioned wait time. We've had a couple questions. Any suggestions on particular ways to get students to use and ask higher level thinking questions?
You know, you can. I mean, students naturally ask higher level questions all the time. We may find them annoying, but so one way you could do it is rather than you. I tried to get in the habit of not leading a lot of discussions, and so what I would do is I would put kids in small groups, and I would let them lead their own discussions. And I may put like an index card with some higher level questions on there for guidance. If it seemed like they were asking questions and it wasn't going anywhere. But most times kids were asking great questions and they were just having these natural organic conversations, and they were learning about, you know, what one another thought from these conversations. So you may need to nudge them every once in a while. Like I said, I had that kind of that scaffold of the index card with questions on it, but kids naturally will come to those questions. And so, you know, you just have to give them space to do it. I mean, I tried to be very cognizant that I was not the one, and you probably are surprised because I'm speaking so much in this webinar. I try not to speak that much in class. I wanted kids to do most of the speaking. And so you have to be able to, you have to have things set up in your classroom that allow them to do that.
Yeah, and I know you also mentioned something interesting about the math test example that you gave that actually did have some higher level questions in there. But we did have a couple questions about how do you help teachers use higher level questions? The feedback you usually get is that those are the kinds of questions that aren't tested. So
And that's precisely why they're really good. But regardless, actually tested. Like I said, if you take your state exam and you take a look at that, you'll probably be surprised. But I'll show you an example of, I'm going to grab the screen real quick. I'll show you an example of a math question that I used to give my fourth graders. So it's this. So if I ask a lower level question, I ask them to identify the shapes. Well, they're just applying their knowledge. They saw the shape, they know what it looks like. So what I would do is I would ask the same question and I'd have them draw it. It could just as easily have them identify it. But then I ask them this follow-up question: which one of these shapes does not belong? And there's no clear-cut answer, by the way, because you may say, well, the circle doesn't belong because it doesn't have any sides. And then you have that kid over here saying, you know, it actually does. It has an inside and it has an outside. So it does have sides. And all of a sudden, there's this rich conversation that's taking place. But it took that probing question. Because if I just said, what is this? And they say it's a square, we're done. You know, I need that follow-up question to really kind of provoke the thinking of students and to think about things in a different way. But what I would say is, you know, it's easier to write lower level questions and to assess lower level questions. It doesn't mean that it's better to do that. I mean, so you have to kind of have to weigh that as a teacher. You know, is my job to teach kids, or is my job to make my job easier? And I always was under the assumption that my job was to teach kids. And so if it made my job a little bit harder, and the reality is once you get used to it and you get the hang of it, your job actually becomes easier because the kids are doing most of the work. My philosophy was always, I've already passed the 7th grade, just barely, but I passed the 7th grade. I should not have to pass the 7th grade again. They have to pass the 7th grade. So give them more autonomy. I talk about that a lot in my project-based learning books, but it also has to do with these questions. You know, ask the kid or have the kids come up with the questions so you don't have to do all the work.
yeah, that's great. Any other tips on promoting student autonomy?
Yeah, I mean, and you can do this with kids. I did this with 3rd graders. Just give them, like, so for example, if I was going to bring in a person that was going to come in and be a guest speaker, rather than me ask questions, I had the students come up with questions, and then they would work on those, and I would email them to the person so they weren't blindsided when the kid asked this bizarre question that was kind of off the wall. But I made sure the kids were the ones asking the questions. And then you should see, like in that classroom, when that question is asked that a kid came up with, they're so excited and proud of what they came up with, and they're interested to know what this person is going to say. But again, that's how you have that engagement with students, is you allow them to do some of the work for you. So when I write when I have those essay questions, they're only a sentence or 2 long. The kids are writing paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of what they know. And so again, I'm giving them the space to tell me what they know rather than me saying, this is what you should know.
Great. Let me see. I think I might have to read a couple more.
That's okay.
um,
Great questions. Great higher level questions, by
yeah,
the way.
definitely. Do you suggest Socratic seminars for elementary gifted students?
Excellent strategy. So and it's funny because I use a Socratic seminar. I didn't call it that, but I didn't know the structure. But I've since observed teachers that have used that, and man, it's so like rewarding to be in a classroom where kids are doing Socratic seminar because they are leading the discussion. It's inquiry learning at its finest, where kids are kind of driving how the learning is going, and they're driving their curiosity. And the really interesting thing is their curiosity is driving them to the exact same place that you would have taken them, but they've gone there on their own, and that's more powerful for them because then they're the ones who came up with that idea, not you. It's the same idea you would have had, but letting them do it makes it more powerful.
Great.
Todd,
Yeah.
I'll jump in while Stephanie's reading one. One that I thought, oh, this is a great question. Is are these strategies effective with kids who are not just gifted? Can this be used and implemented in the regular classroom or with struggling learners, regular learners, or gifted learners?
Excellent question. And what I would tell you is that this book was not designed specifically for gifted kids. It was just for challenging kids in general. So you may have a gifted kid who has quite a bit of information about something, and so you want to ask them higher level questions, but there's going to come a time where that kid doesn't have that knowledge or doesn't have that background, and you have to ask them some lower level ones. Same things with regular ed or special ed kids. You may have a special ed kid that it's just always been fascinated with something. So when you talk about space and the universe, and they've watched like Nova or whatever, and they have all this information, I need to approach that kid differently. Just because he's not gifted doesn't mean I should reserve my higher level questions for just the gifted. I needed to ask that kid higher level questions. And I'll give you a great example that one of my teachers would do. She was teaching fourth grade math, and she always had a bell ringer at the beginning of class. And I was walking around the room, and I noticed that every question was different. And I was like, oh, I noticed that you weren't asking the same question for the bell ringer. She's like, no, because this kid can handle this, and this kid can't handle this. And so the levels of the questions were scaffolded. So if you were just starting out, she asked a question that allowed you to build a foundation. If you had the foundation already, she asked a question that took you a little bit further on that. And so that's another technique that you can do is when you give kids like simple things as bell ringers, or even I talk about in the book, even homework or worksheets, you can ask higher level questions. It doesn't have to be lower level directions. Ask them those higher level questions or what they're thinking about something. The easiest way to do that is, do you agree or disagree? Kids love to argue. And if you can give them the background knowledge to make that argument, it makes it much more legitimate.
That makes sense. Stephanie, maybe one more question. We're kind of running down on time, but maybe one more question before we wrap it up.
Sure thing. We had a couple questions about assessing. So what kind of rubric would you use for this?
Excellent question. Rubrics are right up my alley. I actually have a book on it. So I tried to get away from written assessments as much because I was a social studies teacher towards the end of my career. And so I knew they were going to get writing in the ELA classroom, and they were going to take multiple choice tests in the math. So I wanted to make sure that my class was a little bit different. And so what I wanted to make sure that I did was I wrote questions that allowed them to kind of explore that. And so when I made assessments, I wasn't always taking written questions. It might be an idea, and I want them to show me what they learned. So when I was teaching the American Revolution, rather than teach everyone the same information, I gave like a overview of the American Revolution. And then I told kids, pick something that you thought was really interesting from the American Revolution that I talked about or that you've heard about yourself. And then you're going to become an expert on that, and you're going to teach the class about that. And so then what would happen is, so a kid would say, I want to do the Boston Massacre. And I may have 3 or 4 kids in the class that want to do that. Well, then you become a group. And then I have one kid over here that wants to do, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. He becomes a group unto himself. I may have 7 people over here that want to do the Battle of Saratoga. Because they're fascinated with war or whatever. And so they quite organically form. But what starts to happen is, rather than every kid having to be an expert or have a basic knowledge of everything, these kids become experts and they learn how to learn. And so the next time something like this comes up and they're at home and they have to figure out how to learn something, they know how to do that now. It's that Confucian saying of, if you give a person a fish, they eat for a single day. But if you teach them to fish, they'll eat the rest of their life. And so this higher order thinking is going to get kids to be able to learn for themselves. Because if you just give them all the answers or ask them questions with definitive answers, they are not learning how to learn. They're learning how to memorize. And there's a clear distinction between those two.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I apologize that we didn't get to all of the questions. That you have Todd's contact information if you want to reach out to him with any question that we weren't able to get to. I'm sorry, we have so many folks and there were so many great questions. I do appreciate your participating in that. But let me say to Stephanie, thank you for juggling questions without the upvotes. Okay, before we go, you got to tell why is the operation game up on your wall?
Oh, we did have a question about that.
I saw that.
Yes.
That's why I showed it. So this is my man cave, my basement. And so the table, which has become my office, is actually our game table. And so we have a game closet right over there. So this is kind of our game corner. And I was at a parade of homes one time, and I saw that they took these are like 3D boxes. And so it's not like a picture. And so you could actually put the games in the box and kind of display them. And so we did Scrabble, we did Trouble. You can't see Sorry's over there. I used to have a Ouija board, but it freaked my kids out, so I had to get rid of it. So, but it was just, a decorating idea that we picked up at a parade of homes, and it was fun to make and fun to.
Very cool, very cool. All right, well, so I got derailed there. Stephanie,
Stephanie, that was an important question to answer.
No, it was a great question. Stephanie, thank you for running the Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, sure thing.
And
Thanks.
then Todd, you've been such a delight, and you've done several of these webinars, and I would refer folks back to those webinar recordings to see other things that you've done. You're just always a delightful person to come in. You're so knowledgeable. Your vast experience is so appreciated by all the folks that attend. And so I just thank you for coming, Todd.
No problem. And I thank you for giving me a platform to share that. I mean, it doesn't mean anything if we don't have people like you that are allowing us to share what we know and what we want others to learn as well. So I appreciate that, and Proofrock's work over the years. So.
Well, we're big fans of you too, so that great.
And thanks. Mutual admiration society.
yeah, and thanks everybody for attending. I know that we're in the middle of kind of a crazy time, so that you would carve out some time to come in and have some professional learning is says a lot about you guys. And so thank you. Thanks everybody. Bye bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.